No one is saying something.
I want to rehearse in my mind, but I have to pay That's what they say. Yeah.
I'll check. No, no. No, no. Where's Gregorio? Somebody see Gregorio? Doesn't work. I'll restart it. It's okay, I fixed it. So I should be with you. Safari is moving more. The restart was Safari, like I just go Yeah, that's what I was saying. Are you sitting here?
Welcome everybody. Welcome here tonight, and thank you for your patience. As Reinier de Graaf said, participation takes some time, so we're already starting in the right atmosphere, I think so. Well, welcome at het Nieuwe Instituut, a museum for architecture, design and digital culture. As you might have noticed coming in, we totally transformed to a temporary fashion museum, and it's still on show till the 8th of May, so do come and check it out. It's temporary, so for all the architects who worry, don't worry, we'll do plenty of architecture still. My name is Flora van Galen, and I mostly work on our Thursday night program. That's our weekly public program. But tonight we have a special night, a Friday night, that's initiated by the Berlage, the theory masterclass. And we're very happy that they asked us to host tonight the masses, architecture and participation, since that's really a notion that resonates highly within the Nieuwe Instituut as well. I think all our programs are pivoting around the notion of innovation in a changing society. So notions of people, masses, the citizen, the government, that's all very in flux and important to investigate. As you might know, we're not only a museum for architecture and design, we're also the National Archive for Architecture. And the students group, the workshop, really used that archive thoroughly. Thanks to my colleague Hetty Behrens, they got a chance to dive into it, and they selected material that you can see outside from the Stichting Architect Research, John Habrake project, you might know, but also the archives of the architects Paul de Leij and Jouke van der Woud, think of Bickers Island in Amsterdam, and of course also OMA archive, mostly the project on the Eikplein back in the 80s. It was built in the north of Amsterdam. So I think a beautiful example how the past can be connected to current topics. And as tonight I'm sure we will speculate about a possible future. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Salomon Frausto, who's the head of education of the Berlage. And let's have a great inspirational night. Thank you.
Again, welcome this evening. I'd like to thank, on behalf of the Berlage, the new institute for their hospitality and for the openness and willingness to take on our invitation to have that event hosted here. It's a pleasure to introduce Reinier de Graaf, who, especially in this Dutch context, doesn't really need any introduction, but he's the partner of OMA. He is the director of AMO, and maybe more importantly from my perspective, he's a graduate of Generation 1 from the Berlage. So in this, our 25th Jubilee year, it's a pleasure to have him kick off that celebration by leading the master class for this spring. He's conceptualized tonight's theme of architecture and participation, a topic that is at once politically correct and cliched, but also essential to the future of our discipline. Always an agitator and a challenger of the status quo, Reinier promises, and he really promises, and I believe him to be a man of his word, to be a participant tonight and to give the floor to our 20 masterclass participants, which have traveled from all over the world, even a few transatlantically. Our 5 international guests who, have graciously accepted the invitation to be here, even though they don't know exactly what the hell is going to happen next, and to be truthful, neither do I. To our audience members, one of the things that the Berlage cherishes tremendously is the ability to always be innovative in its formats and outputs. I believe that to be in this age, mediatic age, and age of instant gratification, pertinent to challenging the norms of the discipline. So in search of alternating formats, in one of our first meetings together to discuss the format of the masterclass, we came up with this idea of actually having, what is the outcome of such a thing, of research and exploration. So we decided that it would be an interesting challenge to actually do something that was one-to-one, to create a public event, to do a new form of public participation for the 21st century, so to speak. As the Berlage tradition is always, we encourage the linking of architectural ideas to their political context, offering a wide range of vantage points from which to discuss a set of problematics. So in that sense, we very much encourage this evening a productive dialogue. We encourage that everybody listens to each other. So as my father would always say, can you please take the cotton out of your ears and put it in your mouth? So I would encourage some of you that have that tendency to maybe do that yourselves, and to listen to everybody's ideas. I would also like to say that this has been, for me personally, an experiment in participation. Those of you who know me, know that I tend to be a major control freak. And this for me was one of the first times that I really let almost everything go. And I would like to thank Hugo Corbett for, pulling the reins in that, and just started going for it. Let's see. I also would just like to, in my didactic way as always, or at least try to be, to remind our 20 participants to just simply relax, be confident, be yourselves in this audience, in this room full of people where it may not be so easy. So it will be fine. Just speak slowly, breathe, smile, be gracious. At any rate, I would also personally like to thank Rainier for his uncommitted, full engagement this week. So thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Welcome. I'm very happy, or as a matter of fact, I'm relieved to see a full house. Because, when the subject is participation and there wouldn't be anybody there, we would have failed regardless of the content. I have to say, just looking at it, that the amount of OMA people, I think, is below 25%. Which also means that this isn't a kind of Saddam Hussein rally, where actually those that turn out are actually pulled by the regime. At least not fully. Anyway, what you're about to see is the result of actually 2 weeks of work. But we didn't want to, and it's called a masterclass, which is of course also a ridiculous title related to this subject. It's been 2 weeks of research into the history and the continued relevance of participation, partly historical, partly contemporary, and we didn't want to make it too much of a presentation of student works where the audience is taught at. What we've actually tried to do is a format that in itself presents the work in the form of a debate. So it sort of simulates the English House of Commons with the yay-sayers on this side and the naysayers on that side. The auditorium is sort of triangulated, so we can't have the sort of corridor with the sword length to separate the two, but still that's what it meant to be. Each group we have a Speaker of the House, who is also a moderator, Hugo Colbert, who will take over from me shortly. And what this has been is research that has been structured to 5 deliberately highly irritating questions. How do I click? 5 questions which come to mind. Architecture should welcome participatory design. Agree or disagree? I mean, you all have a sort of a leaflet in your hands, which if you fold it open is white on the inside, red on the outside. White means agree, red means disagree. So and since there is about at least 50% architects, it's a sort of professional introspection.
Keep them up for the minute.
Be honest.
These are the kind of questions that you're meant to say you agree to and think, what a load of bullshit, I don't. The second question, architecture's main purpose is the satisfaction of its users. Not interested. Third, participatory design will help create a human scale. 50-50. Participatory design should not be subject to any form of aesthetical control. Most people disagree. Interesting. And the last one is a sort of deliberately naive, ridiculously optimistic embrace of new technologies, which we all know are not going to work, but as the potential catalyst of participation in a way that's never been shown before. Who thinks that? No. Audience. We'll do a round at the end of the debate to see if anybody changed his mind again. I'd like to introduce our 5 guests. Françoise Fromenot, a French architect, critic, and teacher, former editor of Architecture d'Aujourd'hui and currently at Criticote. You wrote a very nice article about Villa de Lava. So glad to hear you're a fan of at least one of our projects, but that has nothing to do with inviting you. The second person is Ricardo Bofill, who I guess you wouldn't really associate with participatory architecture. However, in being such a fervent opposer of modernism, he's on the side of the people by default. And when you know that people don't want to live in machines, but they want to live in palaces, what further participatory design do you need? The third person is Liza Fjord, partner in MUF. I've read that is a firm which negotiates between the built and the social fabric. I'd love to hear more. I don't know how you do it, but apparently you do. I'm sure for you the word participation goes nowhere near enough, and we're all co-creators in effect. That's at least what I'm assuming, but I'm sure we'll hear more. The last person is Areti Markopoulou, director at the IAAF, an architecture school, I could say, but an architecture school which is an interesting hybrid between looking at the digital technologies on the one hand and manufacturing of the built environment on the other hand. I could say a school that engages with parametrics, the P word. However, the interesting thing, and I witnessed this firsthand on a visit about a month ago, that parametrics here is not necessarily a means to arrive at form, but it's a means to, in a way, engage to make the built environment more tailor-made and hence embrace the wishes of users. I'd like to hand over to our Speaker of the House, who will explain the rules of engagement briefly on the floor. Sorry, the last person. I completely forgot. Thank you for prompting me. How could I? We had, and it still doesn't work, I guess.
We can try one last time.
We can try
I saw
one last
him
one. While you try, I'll
Okay.
Okay. The last person is Lucien Kroll, who does not need an introduction. Clearly, he is the... That's not him.
That's his daughter,
Right.
but it's the only way to get.
That's the only way to get
She
it.
called just now.
He is... Oh, God. There's a sort of technology out of the window. He's the eminence grise of participatory design, of course, very well known from the student housing in Louvain, the medical faculty project, where the first generation of inhabitants became co-creators of their own building. We asked him 50 years later to reflect on his own experiments, looking from the vantage point of now, and to see where he thinks all of this stands and what the continued relevance of this is. And
Yeah, she just called us, but.
okay. Well, if at any point in time technology doesn't fail us, I propose we simply
So I could.
interrupt the meeting for him. Hugo?
I have, I'm the moderator, which you can tell by the, I'm the only one with a headset, which means I can use both hands to moderate. I'm going to go through the rules of participation this evening, very quickly. So the debate is loosely structured around 5 themes, which you can find inside your brochures: beauty, ideology, scale, authority, technology, although those will inevitably intersect. But it's incumbent upon me to move the conversation on to the next category when we've spoken too long. Each conversation will be initiated by an exchange between the students. We very much hope that this is, you guys will begin to interject straight away. You should do so by raising your hand or waving at me or tripping me up as I walk past. I'm a kind of roaming moderator. So in theory, we give the students the 4 minutes as kind of breathing space to kind of get what they want to say said. But if you're really desperate to interject within the first minute, then wave at me furiously. Thanks to the technical wizardry of some of our students, we've been able to set up this groovy arrangement. And I should say, Salomon in his introduction thanked me, but he didn't thank Martin. So Martin, he and I have been working together. And if I'm the kind of... what's that?
Oh, sorry. Sorry. I was distracted by the call.
If I'm the kind of verbal moderator, then Martin is the digital moderator. So if you want to jostle with Martin, then all you need to do is hashtag with the masses. And likewise, the idea is that if you don't want to put up your hand, or if you want to speak anonymously within here, or in theory, I hope it's going on, we are being broadcast live around the world. I should say that. So you can also, I hope there'll be some tweets from far-flung places. So as soon as you tweet, unfortunately it's not immediate, but if you wait for 30 seconds, your point should get across. So you can also anticipate what people are about to say, so you can take your tweet in 30 seconds before they make their point. Guilty of the 5th rule already. Rambling will be discouraged. Keep it concise and courteous-ish, so that everyone can have a voice. And with that, I'm happy to pass over to the... And if you, during the debate, the same rule applies. If you vehemently disagree, then wave the red. And if you want to kind of support somebody who's making the right argument in the wrong way, then wave the white one at me, and I'll pass the mic to you. So there's a mic roaming around the audience. So without further ado.
Hi everybody. I'll continue. So I would like to open this debate by stating that I believe in participatory design and that the architect should actually welcome it because he can greatly profit from it. And as we all know, architects like to see themselves as leading figures, but since 50 years, architecture has been threatened by social change, access to information, and specialization of expertise, and therefore the authority of the architect has been threatened. But the question is, has participation anything to do with this? And I believe it has not. So back in the 70s, as an alternative to the architecture of the modern movement, architects like Lucien Kroll actually came up with an architecture that through intense participation with users, future users, and members of community and many others, they created their buildings in a new way. And well, the result of such a participatory design is actually architecture for people and not for merely architects, and architecture that people actually love to live in.
If I may, to support my colleagues' plea, I want to show you another well-known project. Some of you might recognize it. It's the Honeycomb housing project in Morocco by, among others, Woods and Candilis. And this project, despite all good intentions, was conceived by architects that just based on their own innate sensitivity, assumed that they knew what people wanted and what people needed. But the result, as we can see, demonstrates that this approach was inaccurate and patronizing. Masses must be included for architecture, if you want architecture to still have meaning and function. The work of Alejandro Aravena looks, it's a very good counterexample to this. It looks very similar to the previous approach, but in this case, this time engagement with participation throughout the design process was actually very successful. The actual need of the dwellers instructed the design, and appropriation and further development was welcomed and encouraged within the architect's frame.
So therefore, I would like to state again that I believe that participatory design can actually empower the architect as a representative of many interests, as a leader of the masses.
I actually disagree with everything you're saying. I just need to butt in. Yeah, so participatory design is merely just a shadow and a tool which architects hide behind. I mean, architects aren't humanitarians, they shouldn't be doing humanitarian jobs. Participation is false. I mean, if everyone was given the roles and responsibilities of architecture, who would actually be the architect? So you mentioned the work of Lucien Kroll, and you failed to mention other architects who sort of came from his generation. You could have mentioned Cedric Price, perhaps, or Yona Friedman, which this project is. I mean, even this architecture, which I assume you consider participatory design, still stems from an original and architectural idea, a singular point of origin.
Thinking about the hero figures of the modernist movement, for example, Mies is one of the most outspoken about authority, and he literally says, "I'm the single man." And then, I mean, we all know that the Seagram doesn't come out of the participatory process. So, I mean, despite Mies, also Eisenman sustains the authority and the autonomy of architecture as one of the main features that we have to maintain in order to maintain our discipline progressive and projective as well. And you first mentioned the work of Alejandro Aravena, but we all know that actually this remained just a label to market his own opera. So I clearly disagree, and because architecture has to be maintained autonomous in order to have a discipline which is constantly progressive and projective. Yes, thanks.
So I think Aravena is going to get thrown around like a ragdoll from side to side. Does anyone want to pick up on Aravena at the beginning? You know, amongst participants? Perhaps. Help me out. We've been talking about this all week. I mean, this.
I will take it from here. I mean,
Hannes is going to read from.
yeah. I'm a little bit confused because, regarding to authority. Is it truly just an image of just a self-confirmation, or behind this you truly find like a creative spirit? Philip Johnson said that the act of creation, like birth and death, you have to face it by yourself. So, can we continue from that?
Looks like Pierre is ready for a comeback. Can we pass the mic to Pierre?
Yeah.
It's our first non-masterclass participant, so this is in itself is a great
I
success.
think that focusing the aspect of authority into this is also a lot to do with the macho culture in architecture. So, like, oh yes, I'm the figure, I'm the architect, so I should do as I wish. So, in that sense, participatory design actually includes other voices, like women, for example.
But it doesn't, according to your
Can we pass the microphone?
it doesn't, according to the author of the primer, because I'm so petty, I counted, and I think there's less than 10% of women authors in the primer. So actually, you're wrong, because this is a canon that has been set out for you today. So they're just obedient students, which is like you were talking about that earlier. So, pass it back. There is a lot written though within not just feminist discourse about voices and expertise. So I suppose we talk about authority, but there's also expertise. So the possibility of accuracy. I think that many architects, even some in this room, do listen to their clients when the clients are paying for it. I think you'll find that in the single person house, choices are made, and we can perhaps return to that later.
I would like to say that actually we need, we use participation in order to gain knowledge, how to build something. Like we gain the knowledge from the society in order to produce something for them. But then why we don't use observation? Like this is what architects actually like. Research includes not only reading or googling something. It's also including observation itself. So if you go on the street and like observe how people live, how they use the spaces, it gives you already this input. And you don't basically need to have a social poll for that. You have your eyes for that. You're trained to see that things.
It looks like we have a crawl interruption.
But then we can immediately.
Oh.
Okay.
Hello. Hello.
Hello. We are all here.
Ça marche.
Oui, ça marche bien. Alors, vous pouvez commencer avec votre présentation tout de suite.
Il est temps. Où est-ce que vous êtes là? Il est parti. Oui. Oh là 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 là. Aïe aïe, c'est bien. Allez, on y va.
Excusez-moi, pouvez-vous ajuster la caméra un petit peu parce qu'on voit seulement une partie de votre tête.
Oui, c'est vrai. C'est mieux ça.
Oui, parfait, c'est parfait.
C'est toute une main. Voilà.
Nous sommes prêts.
Oui.
We are ready.
עושים לי לפי מפתי. Voilà. Alors, ça va toujours. Now, first, I want to thank you for your patience and also for mine. I'm very happy to be with you electrically speaking. I should like to make an observation. You know Vitruvius, about architecture, the Greek philosopher, said that its architecture is three things: utilitas, firmitas, and venustas. Utility, solid, and beauty. I want to add humanitas, because it's lacking. It was in the Greek centuries. It was natural, but it is no more natural, humanitas. So, let's speak about authorities, political organization, very roughly taken on the roots, and very fast. Royalty, absolute royalty, that was very simple. One person had all the authority and condemned or congratulate as he wants to do. Happily, it was tempered, softened by assassination. Secondly, the revolution, let us say the French Revolution, they cut the head of the king, and then they were there all together, and they didn't know how to decide anything. That was a technical problem, and really, it was very annoying. And one was a former Dominican, and he said that in his convent, that was a universal suffrage. We count all the, yes, all the people, and the majority wins. That was a new thing, so they went until today. But it was not enough, because the translation was difficult between millions of people and hundreds of them. So the hundreds were separated from them. Well, a very curious adventure happened about the suffragette. You know what it is? The suffragette was the ladies in London, in England, trying to get the voting right. And they were massacred by the police, by all the adults, the politicians, and they learned judo to defend themselves against policemen. And the policemen were lying on the ground. And they had the right, after the war, from 1910 until the end of the war. De Gaulle gave to all the women the same right as the men. That was a sort of personal war. Why? Naturally, because that's their right. But the principal thing no one speaks about is that having the right of voting, they will soften the decisions of the males. And that is fantastic, because after that, it should have been forbidden to see French, or German, and English, or Canadian general throwing 20,000 young French peasants on the Marne battle that were killed on one day with the knife. 20,000. How? Because of the invention of industry. All the wars, even Napoleon, were organized very radically, intelligently organized to win. But they had tools that were not efficient. Suddenly they invented some sort of a machine gun. It's a machine suddenly, not a weapon. It's a machine just pouring bullets on people coming that were making a mountain until the night. And if the women had the right to decide, they will never accept that thing. Better to make peace, let us say. So now it's not to tell you amusing stories, but to speak about architecture. The humanitas, we don't have it anymore because of the savage, the wild industrialization of our trade, our practice, etc. And we are under the rule of the Bauhaus. The summit of the Bauhaus, that was 1915, 20 something, a century ago. And the Bauhaus is still the rule. We need something like the suffragette to soften the thing. And the question is that architecture has no politic side. That is not true. Zero politic is a terrible politic. So, to explain the impossibility, before the war, in the years 30, before 40, Adolf Hitler closed the Bauhaus. Not because it was bad architecture or something, but because they were communists. Except Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe was not a communist, but a Christian. Well, that's his right. And he went to his office in Berlin and invited some students to continue the studies in his office. That was a hero. Okay. But, and bizarre, I learned it, I read it in a Dutch newspaper. He wrote a letter to Baldur von Schirach, who was the Minister of the Culture that Adolf Hitler named. And the letter was asking him to name him the chief architect of the Third Reich that had to be to have a length of life of 1 millionaire. That was awful. But I say it without regret. He was not guilty because politics had nothing to do with architecture in that time, except for some of them. Le Corbusier did the same with Benito Mussolini, and he was also innocent. His political ideas were outside that. Then came, I go fast, 68. 68 is the result of an evolution of violence that against public decisions, and that was violent but still civilized, and they obtain a sort of a right, like the suffragette, to be part of the decision. Well, architecture is still absent. Then 68, but 10 years later, a little more, 70, the Catholic University had decided to install a new hospital, 1,000 beds, the faculties, all the buildings necessary to organize a campus, and for the social zone was called the buildings for students inhabiting, etc. That was a separate part of the whole organization. And they asked a friend architect of mine to organize a general plan type 1850, as the American universities still now. And the students revolted against the plan. Suddenly, medical students understood the morality of architecture and town planning much more than the architects, who were blind and absent. And they insisted to be part of the decisions of the board of the directors. They demanded one seat mute without speaking, but just to be there and understand what happens. They were chased violently, but as they are intelligent, not revolutionary but reformist, they came back saying, well, that's okay, but we want to choose our architect. The general administrator thought they are completely mad. What for? And he said yes. And I had nothing to do with the Catholic University. I did not know anyone of that thing, never put a foot in the hospital, etc. And they chose me. Why? Because they asked to other comrades, what is an architect? And they understand that there was one case that was in La Cambre, where I was student during this manifestation violently in the streets. But during the night, I came to help the students to win a war, a year, otherwise they lose that year. And meanwhile, I explained what I think about architecture, because they were doing so. And they answered that to the students, so they asked me, they demanded me as their architect. And I was not known, but accepted. So when the administrator said to me that I was chosen, immediately I went in Leuven, and get contact with those people I did not know. And we were together for 2 years, every week, every 2 weeks or months, without holidays, but as much as possible, meeting of 2 persons, 12, an average of 6, 200 with Louis Leroy. He made a lecture to explain what he was about gardens, and the authorities understood very well, and they forbade me to ask him. So I asked him to come the Saturday and the Sunday, and that was okay.
Excuse me, Mr. Kroll, we have a lot of debate and. What? No, sorry, you can say.
Yeah, sorry, carry on.
No.
Nothing, I just enjoy listening to you.
Okay, we were wondering how much time, because we have the other debate, and then there's only 1 hour left for us.
Yeah. I will close that with 2 sentences. Well, we worked together, and no decision was taken without their creation and advice. It gives a sort of an architecture which is different without that. And sadly, 2 years afterwards, the administration understood what it was about. They were cheated. They didn't understand. So I was pushed away, fired, and that's all. Is that okay? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci. Au revoir.
Good appetite.
I do not have the toothpick. There's no presentation.
Good evening.
Bye. You can call again if you want to.
I was going to say, if we see the Skype, if we see the Skype button bobbing, then we said something to annoy the great Lucien Crow. So if we had, it's unfortunate because it would have been good to have.
Do we vote on keeping Kroll or not?
For instance, I think it's clearly asking. It'd be interesting equally. This I took the time to tweet a picture of the project he was talking about. For those of you who don't know, this is the medical housing project in Louvain, which will come up in conversation further. It would have been interesting to hear because we heard the build-up to Louvain, and then we heard about Louvain very quickly. It also would be interesting to hear how Louvain folds out over the next 30 years, and maybe we will in the coming conversations. So now's a good time to move on to the next topic. Well, Lucien rather took the time. Do you want to comment on specifically on Lucien's?
In participation, does the architect need to be responsive to a situation as it unfolds?
Is architecture a reactive process?
Within participation, does the architect, i.e. Lot, need to learn to respond to a situation as it unfolds? That's a question. That's my question. If they do.
No.
So maybe what
Nana's gonna come with the.
I think it's interesting to. Yeah, I think one of the things that was very interesting what Lucien was saying is that he was doing exactly that. That he was. It would have been an interesting question for Lucien to hear how pragmatic he was in the way he chose this moment to participate. Because he was a young architect who would have a very hard shot at doing such a housing project. So maybe he also really felt the spirit of the time and thought that, well, if I participate, I might actually get a decent commission out of it.
I think he said also something very important to understand the difference between then and now. He said that people were better architects than the architects themselves. So in the 60s and 70s, I think there was a political, we have to resituate that historically, although it's not so distant from us. But how much the situation has changed. People like him and lots of others, 68ers, were believing as a political faith that people should be bestowed the right to extract themselves from being considered as masses, and we can perhaps discuss your title as well, and be given the possibility to express their individual desires, interests, etc. Today, I think with a very different political, economical, etc. situation, which is ultimate neoliberalism, we've shifted towards the reverse, which is the epitome of individual rights in a very individualistic society, from which the obligation to consult people because they think they have the right to be heard is very different from that. It's actually the absolute reverse symmetry. And in that respect, the question that is posed, should architects welcome participatory design, is tricky because welcome supposes that it's there, that it's inevitable, and that what is asked is what attitude should we have towards something that is one more constraints that comes precisely from a reverse situation than when Lucien Kroll was actually going towards people.
you want to summarize before we move on to?
We can even go on the next topic because you actually introduced it. We were asked if the main purpose of architecture was the satisfaction of its user, and we do agree, because we believe architects should really be able to recognize the essence of the society we live in, therefore assess their values and standards. And yeah, this means giving the masses the right to be part of the decision making regarding the built environment, for sure.
I'm sorry, but exactly this kind of dangerous statement have led the societies to attain this ideological, let's say, numbness. And I will continue from what Ms. Romano said. If you can bear with me for a moment, Francis Fukuyama, some years ago, wrote this beautiful book about stating that we have already reached the end of ideology. Well, this means that neoliberal forms of democracy have led the people to believe that there is no better alternative, and therefore there is no need for a future social change. And when the power is given to the masses like this, then it means that we have reached the end of history, actually, and the end of ideology. Well, I think it's an educated guess that most of the architects here today have some way or the other been educated and trained to think and act in this authoritative manner, in the footsteps of Mies, for example. Of course, I know that maybe the opposition will argue that there have been some people like Hundertwasser, for example, that try to give this power of decision and decision making regarding special issues to the people, but I urge you to take a look and tell me who are we going to trust, the guy in the chair or the guy on the toilet?
Yeah, but sure, it is so provocative. Yeah, I guess you should trust them both. I mean, they both stand for the image, I guess, the image of the society they envision. Yeah, but we should remember also we are discussing about masses, not mass, which means that it's a very diverse collection of individuals with very different needs. And yeah, this image also proves that there is a big ideological gap between the architecture of the two. Hundertwasser was the author of the Molderness Manifesto, and he was strongly positioning himself in favor of the individual as the one who should actively engage and yeah, shape his own environment. But as also you can see from this facade, this image proves that architects can still maintain authorship, which is they are obsessed with, while engaging participation.
When there is an inclusion of people in the design process, more often than not, I think the result is catastrophic. The masses are reduced to mere answers and questionnaires, and add this to compromise the design solutions of flexibility, and we have something which is a crude echo of what architecture could be. The architecture should not be compromised. To me, an architect is in a position to have a larger vision for everybody and not just succumb to whimsical requests from everybody. And he's able to unite and think for the larger public good and have tangible solutions to larger spatial issues. And I don't think I need to say anything more like the streets in the sky.
Yeah, put the microphone into the audience very quickly. See if there's a kind of a nice segue. Do we have enough microphones to go around? We have our Italian archives.
Can I just make a point to what you said about losing that if there is no ideology, there's an end to it, and also to Kroll's point that we are not political. And actually, that really made an impression on me. I think that we are not political. We are actually a part of society. We are a part that does a certain job towards the society, and because we have the luxury of not being political, we also have the luxury of listening to other people.
What makes you say we're not political?
Yeah, so we are not political. We don't have the money to say, okay, you're going to build 50 houses here. No, we have to ask this guy, do you want to have 50 houses here? Right? So it depends on who we have. We are always, or usually we are dependent on, unless you don't have $1 million, but usually we are dependent on other people and what their opinions are and on the people that have some sort of say or some sort of power in it. But we also have the luxury to sort of decide who we want to listen to. Is it to the dictator who says that you have to build a giant house somewhere, or 500,000 units somewhere in the middle of nowhere in China, because somebody pays for it and says you have to do it? Or do we listen to the masses?
Just your exploration, I was saying that participation in masses would be chaotic in terms of architecture. And one example I want to show from Portugal, and we had the participatory design that was solved in terms of social housing. And actually, the best example had the most participation, and actually the architect, Caesar, is a kind of control freak. And nowadays, that work is the only one that is still maintained and fully occupied by the inhabitants. That's in Porto. So it doesn't lead to chaos. It depends on the way you manage the process of participatory design. And also, it varies according to the program and the needs. Let's say, do you need participatory design to make a bank, design a bank? I don't think so. Or small one. But social housing, yes. That's why Aravena in Chile is working so well.
I will take it from there, because I do agree that there is a difference in the nature of architecture that we're talking about. It's of course different if we're talking about a resort or a social housing or an urban planning project. So definitely one thing that I am thinking about is that at the end of the day, it's almost as most important to design the process of participation rather than allow the participation to emerge in ways that you cannot really, let's say, not control, but like allow to emerge. No? And I'm saying that because I think that we need to be able to raise awareness with architecture. And not always this can be done together with the people. Because a few days ago I was in Mumbai, in some informal settlements where people were asked how the redevelopment of their neighborhood want to be. And then the conclusion of the surveys and the meetings and the model meetings and observations is that the people just wanted to have a bigger house. Is this what we want from architecture? Just to give them a bigger house? Aren't we concerned about the environmental issues? Yeah, but I do think that when we went there and started to talk with them, and we said, because they have this kind of market on the streets, and then we said, where does the food coming from? And they had to go to the other part of the city, to outside the periphery, where the agriculture is happening, etc. And when we told them that they could actually grow their food in the urban environment, they were shocked. They've never seen that. They've never listened to that. They didn't know. No? Same would happen probably to generate energy. I don't know. But what I'm saying is that it makes a lot of importance to me how we design the participatory processes so that people could decide, but like giving them kind of options that probably they would never.
It's interesting because the accusation Liza made about the reader being very male is also very Western. So maybe there are also different models of participation which work on in different purposes.
I suppose, if this model is the British House of Commons, which presume you know through TV or watching on the internet, is different from a debate, because in a debate there is a requirement to define your terms. And I think, so maybe we just accept no one's going to define their terms, we'll assume everybody's understanding of each of these words, which are loaded and thick with different references depending how old you are. You know, I suppose that's the difference. But if you're going to model it on the House of Commons, you better get a little noisier. Otherwise, you have to be more like the Debating Society, Oxford Union, and define your terms. So choose one way or the other.
You single-handedly compensate.
We have a quick one from Jana first, and then Dr. Rania.
To maybe add on to that, perhaps?
We have Jana first, and then we'll I'll be building up for this in 2 weeks. It's taking these like 40 days.
So maybe to add on to that and to ask basically a question perhaps, I am sitting here in the pro-participatory section, but to try maybe and differentiate two versions of participation that we have been mentioning so far. So the participation which includes the architect and the client himself, which is something that is unavoidable. It's a part of our profession, we cannot work without it. And the participation of the masses, which is kind of a vague essence in a way of, well, anyways, an example that today has been become more and more cliche in a way of users trying to act and subject their opinions of what the architecture should be. But perhaps what we should ask, in a sense, that the architecture is more permanent at the end than its users. So what does the user participation in a way, what effect does it have long term if we create architecture that is very specified to their specific users and where the user participation is very strong and the architecture is related to a specific kind of, yeah. So what is the long-term, in a way, consequence of this user participation?
Ready?
No, I was just thinking, because I mean there's an interesting notion that if you design a participatory process that almost automatically goes against having to confront whatever unfolds. I mean, it almost goes against even the format of an evening like this is that very unfortunately we don't intervene. Bush and Crawl will probably speak for 2 hours, and in the strictest terms you would need to let that happen if you're earnest, because any choreographing, I mean, one of the most successful systems in the world at this moment is simulated democracy. It's even an official term in Russia, where the participatory process is designed to such an extent that you know the outcome of elections in advance. So I'm very nervous in a way about sign, and I think it's an inevitable engagement with chaos that I think architects are almost by definition uncomfortable with.
And there's an interesting essay reflecting on Ville Blanche, a project by Lucian Crow, which is that exactly someone who did a very heavily designed participatory process, which is also rather dysfunctional.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful with that. Like Colin Rowe was already saying that in his book Berlage City, that we should not go from total design into total management. So also this kind of design process, or Giancarlo De Carlo was rather saying that the process itself needs to be something iterative, or like reciprocal to the user, something that is always getting informed again and changes over time also. So what we did also now in a way, like we reacted then to the process was maybe to listen to crowd at the beginning, and then we just decided to do it a little bit later, so we have to be open also in this kind of process.
Well, Giancarlo De Carlo is a very good example of, I think, I'm glad you mentioned De Carlo, because to me it's really a good example of finding a third way between resignation of the architecture and total mastery. But that also comes from the fact that he was working on the whole city and not only on the building, and with the political powers completely with him and not only the users. Because when you talk about architecture and users, it's very different from who is the client. They're not the client, the users in social housing. So how do you sort of navigate between these various terms? I agree with Lisa. I mean, you should perhaps define more clearly what is participatory design and who are the actors, which is their political status, economical status, in perhaps using various cases. I'm sure you've studied many, but De Carlo is a very good instance, I think, of something quite felicitous in the relationship between the three terms.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned social housing, because I mean the classical notion of participation as we know it from all the 1970s imagery is very closely related to social housing when the client was somebody different than the user, very different from a traditional, but at the same time the user, particularly in urban renewal, was still known. It was still a group you could invite to an evening and hear their views, whatever happened there. In the market economy, the user is really unknown. You no longer build for a known group of users. Property developers build in order to attract users, which means that you go from a comparison with one unknown, namely the building, to a comparison with two unknowns, where simultaneously the building you're going to produce is unknown and the users you're going to produce unknown. And from experience, particularly working for commercial clients, even when they build affordable housing, is a comparison with two unknowns and a perpetual second guessing, where supposed wishes of the users, who you don't know, and therefore supposedly are the most conservative wishes imaginable because they're the safest, leads to a very reactionary brand in architecture. At which point I would think once the users would be known, you probably find that they're a whole hell of a lot more progressive than the general stereotypical assumption of users' wishes as it exists in marketing models.
Yes, but then there are cases where the users can't be known, because we're talking about architecture, but if again we shift to what, I don't know, but in France, for instance, it's not so much for architecture that participatory design is now, or participation, let's say, is almost compulsory for politicians of all sides whenever there is an urban project concerned. And then the question is that who is representing the users? And then you find some other body which is supposed to represent, but is sometimes self-elected or self-decided as representative of users, who become the I would say that challenge the architecture, not only the design, let's say, and that's another level of complexity and of political discussion we could have. Because we seem to have shrunk the debate on participatory design understood as poor proletarized people that have no say about where they're going to live and where the architects, in an old 1968 sense, but basically, this rarely happens, at least not in the West. It's a completely different level of participation that happens for urban projects, in an urban renewal, or sometimes in very posh areas. And do we discuss that as well, or I think it's an issue.
I think it's fantastic that somebody finally brought up kind of participation in urban scale, especially in Rotterdam, where everyone is so hyped about so-called tactical urbanism, and which in a way emerged especially after 2008, when many people, let's say the Generation Y urban activists, claimed certain responsibility for certain parts of the city, trying to kind of organize so-called participation in a way, and then I think in Rotterdam I'm a good example, but then again it's a question of, in a way, is this kind of so-called bottom-up urbanism and all this like kind of super hyped infrastructure around it, is this in a way actual participation, or is it just very kind of high quality Generation Y lobbying, all dressed in kind of wool sweaters and MacBook Pros?
Can we kind of seamlessly fold this into the discussion about scale? Is that a way that we can... And with theatrical entrance of a lot of...
I'm Italian, yeah.
Can you briefly explain what we just wheeled in before we launch into your...
Yeah, of course. Well, what you see before here is a model made by John Hambrocken and between architect and research, looking at flexible forms of housing. Like Lucy Kroll, one of these cool cats in the 60s who were interested in giving human agency within mass housing. So we declared that participatory design will help to create a human scale, because it always makes something finite and local against the homogenization of the masses. So, as you know, there was like a bunch of cool cats doing some stuff in the 70s, and We're not going to really talk about that very much because, I'm sorry, Lisa, but we're not very obedient students. Rather, we're going to look more at what's happening now, because if you look at this condition was a reaction against sort of the homogenization coming from mass housing in the welfare state. And as has been mentioned, we're now in a condition where participatory design has become a way of reacting against the hegemony of the neoliberal state. This is a Berlage project in Berlin, which is a way of basically individual people that can't find an appropriate form of housing in the city collectivize and build their own houses with working with an architect and building, financing, and designing the project themselves. And while in sort of what exists in the real estate market normally is a highly privatized form of housing, there's a lot of collective spaces, a lot of shared amenities that are possible when the scale of the group is defined. And similarly, what's interesting is that when you look at the sort of aesthetic value of it, it's almost a return to this 50s mass housing that people like Kroll and Bracken were struggling against in the first place. So we've come almost full circle aesthetically, which leads us to the conclusion that participation is always a reaction of the status quo. Now, my colleague on the other side of the bench will make an absurd claim that, that participation is about finding a consensus. But we all know that participation is not about consensus. It's about it's a rejection of what has been offered to people. Otherwise, you would never participate in the first place. So this image from Gezi Park, the first thing that they do when they take over the park is they build a barricade to define a limit between the participants and the masses, in this case, the populistic state. So to conclude, the moment that you participate is the moment that you define a human scale in opposition to the masses.
So, on the contrary, we disagree. As you can see. So we think, we think that participatory design does not create a human scale, an individual or a unit. On the contrary, we think that real participation leads to a consensus, to a grid. So back to the struggles of the 60s and the 70s with the model of John Bracken, and with the intention of creating giving the inhabitants a new role and some possibilities of interacting in their own environment. John Bracken created this grid where he separated two main structures. One was the support, which was the role of the architect. The architect was in charge of creating the main structure, shafts, and he left the infill to the users, so to the inhabitants. This is what they were in charge of. But we think that Bracken's model was not participatory. So, in our opinion, individual appropriation of private space, it is not participation. And I will using the same Baugruppe project that my colleague presented, but from the facade that he forgot to mention, we can actually affirm that this participation actually led to uniformity. And here, we can actually say that individual was not an important element or component. It was rather the democratic process and an egalitarian distribution of identical apartments that actually made the project a participatory project. Yeah, you can pass. Yeah. So, finally, and to conclude, I would like to refer the I plan from OMA, the master plan. And so in the early 80s, a young group of architects needing a big project, they decided to use participation as the slogan in order to obtain this project.
So curious enough is that in order to obtain this project as a participatory project, they had to create a very strong diagram. This is the one you see in red on top of it, that eventually wrapped up the entire project until the end. So what we say is that the diagram made appropriation possible, and this was not a participatory process. So in light of this, this bench, we conclude that episodic designs, where individuals are concerned, cannot consolidate into a singular design. And this actually represents the failure of participatory processes. Is very different.
We have plenty of OMAs in the audience. One of you might want to defend or deny or speak about it.
So utterly unclear what the participatory process is in your opinion. It's such a crude way of applying this notion. It seems that the participatory process in this discussion is designing the outcome of collective whatever, doing or meddling around, unclear. But you could also think that the participatory process is adding intelligence to a design process, which is a different understanding, I think, of potential participatory processes.
I guess it's a matter of understanding whether we are interested on a final outcome of architecture, like meaning a final aesthetic or formal or typological outcome, or kind of a more open design, right? Because if we are talking about participation and we have a process that it ends with a kind of a final outcome, then I don't see how participation is so important. I think that what it becomes more relevant is to create systems that are able to allow maybe not participation but customization to happen, no? Like allow that the spaces are inhabited in a different way. And this is happening due to the needs of the users. This could happen because the needs of the users are changing. So even if the users today, they think or they believe that they need something, in 10 or 15 years they will need something else. And it's really then very important whereas we're talking about a final form or a final configuration.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I think that if the ultimatum means of participation is just give the space to users to actually being able to customize their space, then I would say that we as architects, we might react by not designing a complete architecture, but just by leaving, let's say, a system that is open to interpretation. In my opinion, this is really dangerous to a certain extent because it's like not confirming the role that we are recovering as professionals. And the same.
Our role is changing as well.
Yeah, I recognize the shift, but it's also real that we have to understand that participation, in my opinion, is when mass. Well, already for me, saying masses, it has negative connotation because it's always a reduction of the individualism for the generic. And at the same time, I would say that participation for me, a real example of participation is when the people from Berlin, they decided to stop real estate development of Tempelhofer Feld. That's real act of participation on the urban scale and on architectural scale. So participation needs to stop, in my opinion, at a certain process, and then architecture comes an answer with other means.
But by that, so then, therefore, participation is preventative and architecture is projective.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say so, and also I would say that participation needs to be always informed by politics, and people need to take a stand and have a clear idea about how they do inform what kind of ideology they're stating, if they take one part or the other.
But I kind of wonder though, because I mean, is it when you and clearly the masses stop being the masses when you're not designing for the masses but with the masses? That is clearly impossible. So that was the point. I mean, you do get that. What I find difficult is that there is a number of very preconceived notions that when you discuss. I mean, first of all, the masses are not the masses, but they're individuals. Individuals together, they don't get anywhere in life. They don't cause political overthrows, etc., etc. And then, as soon as they become a collective, they are against something. And you see that whenever there is a referendum organized, whether it's on the EU Constitution, whether it is on Brexit, which I'm sure they will leave, whether it is on a simple geopolitical sensible thing like an association treaty with the Ukraine, it always is no. As soon as you organize a referendum, regardless of the content, it becomes a no. It becomes a rebellion against the question at hand. And if you reformulate it in a negative, you probably get a completely opposite outcome. And that I find a very dispiriting notion, because that also means that participation can only exist in a form of dialectic with something that is projective. Because once you're successful in rejecting everything, in the end there is nothing, and then there's nothing to reject, then there's no point in participating, at which point it becomes a very nihilistic proposition, at least from that point of view.
It's just a false comparison, right? We're talking about design and not about political decision process.
Well,
with design is always trying to come up with a new thing.
Yeah, as are politics. I think that's a very debatable false comparison that you're
Probably what we would need to inform those masses, and having referendums that they can work fine. It's just having a good information tool, which is not the actual media that we do have nowadays.
This is as proven by the Scottish referendum in independence.
Probably the problem is really in the media, it's not in the masses, who inform the masses.
Claire wants to speak in French.
I have a question maybe for Vinny or others, is on the question of the individual not having any power in relation to the masses, and also because you're making the sort of connection between politics and architecture. One thing that this setting is missing, if this is in fact the British Parliament, is a crossbencher, which is an actual individual, which is unparty affiliated, who is critical to kind of stirring things up.
Well,
so
we
to
have a
speak.
kind of publieke tribune with a whole load of...
But we don't know their party affiliation. They haven't made that clear. And so, my question,
are you volunteering?
No. Sort of, maybe. No, but my question is whether, maybe this goes to also many things that have been said, is whether, and also the comment from the other side of the bench about architects not being political, which is inevitably impossible, because if we have a client, regardless of whether the client is an individual or the client is the masses, no matter who our client is has a politic. And therefore the means with which we associate with them inevitably also has a political association. So the question is, can the architect be the crossbencher? In fact, can the architect ever be the unparty affiliated person that's intended to stir up the party? Or do they inevitably have to pick sides?
Are you asking me?
Anybody?
Anyone? Also from with the front row?
Because I have an answer. It's a very good point that you are as political as to who you choose to be loyal to, and it is the problem of any architect that he is forced to build a series of shifting loyalties to a successive range of clients, and nevertheless he's expected to leave a coherent body of work, which is already an inherent difficulty. What I find, it depends whether or not you can be a crossbencher. Depends very much on the amount of leverage you have, or the amount of leverage you can organize vis-a-vis your client. I mean, in a triangulation, that if you take any project, let's say in a Western country, let's say in the city of Rotterdam, whatever gets built is the result of a triangulation between the client, the architect, and the public authorities who have to approve what the architect has designed. If that process works, to a limited extent, you can be the crossbencher between the two, and then you simply have to assume that the public authorities, represent the elected government of a city, and therefore, to an extent, represent the people that voted for them. But that only works if the public sector itself has a dialectical position to the private parties to whom it has relegated the initiative. So I think the sense is you are political, but I mean how suspect you are that there is a certain margin where you can seal your fate to an extent. I mean, apart from rejecting commissions that are outside wrong, downright wrong. But Ricardo.
Yes, I need to participate now. I won't get invited to participate in the future. I understand that. I was waiting for the IT question, which was easier. more specific. So, what was the question, Ray?
Participatory design will help create a human scale, and we got from there towards.
Can the architect be a crossbencher?
Architect should be a crossbencher.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about the architects, of the pyramids as an extreme example, right? They have a pharaoh, and they're doing these triangular sort of pyramids, right? So that's sort of the symbol of that hierarchy, and working, of course, with slaves and at the end, were they all participating in this venture? I don't quite remember the name of this great architects, actually, if they were real slave drivers or what was going on there. I know there was a lot of hierarchical in the past, extreme examples also in the American culture with the pyramids, and the Spanish culture with the way that the architect, in a way, needs to be on the top of the arc. I say arc and architect has a relationship, so the architect, in a way, has to be on the top of the decision-making process, and at the same time, it has to participate in, as Ray was saying, with the authorities and with the clients. The last thing I wanted to say was about IT. I don't know if I should say it right now.
Save it for the IT.
Save it for the IT, so I want to just pass on.
Before IT, we have to go through beauty, which could be, people might have something to say about that. So do you want to sum up while we
Well,
switch
this is a moment at which I might become a crossbencher. It's an interesting point about these slaves. When we look at these Berlin Bauberg projects, it's a big question to me whether this is coming out of some sort of will to build for themselves, or it's just because housing isn't available in the normal market anymore. So is this whole new wave of participation coming out of a real will to build and take a voice in the formation of the built environment, or is it actually just a sublimation of capitalist processes all over again?
Okay, I'll move over there. Penultimate
We've converted one so far.
success.
So I was asked this question regarding beauty. If participatory design should not be subjected to any form of aesthetic control. I was happy to answer this. Actually, I agree. Because being beauty unquantifiable and very subjective, it is maybe the first aspect of architecture that we could actually, as architects, release and take out our ego and leave it for the others to participate in. So my line goes a bit through, since we're living in mass consumption, we have this opportunity and this great freedom in the making of beauty. Actually, if we architects insist in working with aesthetics, we would probably result in losing our jobs. For example, this case I'm showing now, WikiHouse, where participation is extensively demanded. There, consumers not only asked to buy or consume, actually, but to produce their own houses, enabling them to suit their desires and values. In the other hand, we have architects or even great public figures, such as Prince Charles, who is advocating for the tastes of the masses, but he is actually building mini castles. These are maybe too much assumptions. He is probably reflecting much more on his own childhood rather than thinking of anybody. The next place. I really believe that aesthetics in architecture has to surrender to the inevitable commodification. We have to keep faith in the masses, as we are calling it today, for them to take a standpoint according to, at least in aesthetics, it's a first step they could do. At this point, participatory designs in terms of aesthetics is no longer necessary, since the taste of the masses is absolutely absorbed. This would eventually turn the work in a gigantic runaway, displaying the beauty of the masses.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't agree, because in times of mass consumption, as you have already said, I think architects are even more important. I think that the mediating between the users, the client, as we have said before, we can really forge a new aesthetic of democracy, grounding the context, and at the end, I think it's also a way to empower ourselves. So it's not just a matter of people, it's also about what is our role in society. And looking at the looking at this example that is Biker Estate by Erskine, we can really see that we should always engage people, and I'm saying people, not masses, in the participation and in the design process, without giving up our aesthetic role. If we don't do this, so if we don't have this model, the result is that answering just to the client, form follows the market, so the profit, and we have this kind of result that is a failure. This is in South Korea, it's the Songdo IPD. It has been done as a utopia of a new eco-city, but is a fail, and so is it the city of the future? Is it what we want?
So we can wonder if participatory design should or should not be subject to any form of aesthetic control. Of course, Songdo is not the city of the future. It lacks beauty, it misses humanity, and it's only in the presence of the architect that the user has his voice and that real beauty can result, avoiding these inhuman cities. And so we can ask the question, of course, like in what way, in which amount, or to which extent the user influences or can influence the aesthetics of a project.
You first thinkers on aesthetics. I think an interesting one we've talked about several occasions across this past fortnight is Almira and the tendency when all aesthetic freedom is given, that people tend to conform to very narrow choice. They don't want to look different from their neighbors.
But you have to give them time. It's
so that second house will be the third house and the fourth house.
Without architects, they would know how to do it.
But I think, like Nina suggests, it depends on the question, and we're getting towards the end, so this is what I bring from the coalface of praxis, is if you substitute the word participation for accuracy, then you get back to our personal decision not to do any domestic projects, because what we saw was generally the person paying for it is not the person living in it within the power relation sale model. And so if you extend that to the scale of the city, is that you just spend a little longer, it will not make you rich, by working in quite an old-fashioned way of working with an accuracy of response. And so I think that, if the question had been, should architects work without a brief, you probably would say, no, a brief is good. So equally, to take some quite old-fashioned models is that there is very little participation going on. And so if you want your project to have an accuracy, that unsolicited research, that unpaid forness, and that's in a sense the place of the crossbench, is you will have to go out to find your clients. And I think that then the idea of the tick list of aesthetic choices becomes moot, because in fact you are just can behave like an architect, but you have to do that groundwork first.
I have a question, and it's something we've discussed in the context of the studio, and I would like, Ricardo, also your input on this. I have a problem. First of all, I don't know what the aesthetics of democracy are. And in as much as they exist, I think mediocrity is the aesthetic of democracy so far. I mean, I'm really troubled, and sorry to compare, to resort back to political systems, but bear with me. If you look at the representation, the symbolic representation of political system, the higher the body count, the more aesthetic the visual representation. I won't go into detail, but I mean the 20th century is a very clear example of that. We did this project in the office with Nana. How have you? On trying to find a visual representation for something as intricate, wrought, fair as the European Union. Impossible. It's not even a country. You don't even know who's the leader. Henry Kissinger said, Europe, what is its phone number? Nevertheless, it's a very modern political system, in my view, that makes a continent whole without appointing a leader. Therefore, it doesn't have a capital. If we needed to make a capital, all of it didn't, all of it debatable again, I think. But nevertheless, I struggle personally that, in terms of my personal aesthetic taste, the more I get aroused by the aesthetics, the more radical the aesthetics are, and whether they be extremely left or extremely right-wing. To some extent, an aesthetic dimension is the extent to which it can actually mobilize a large consensus, a large aesthetical consensus on behalf of people to create a certain amount of coherence, composition at a scale where in the market economy and in a democracy composition is simply impossible. Ricardo, you drew a plan for Moscow where you essentially put 11 million people in a kind of long Champs-Élysées running to this. I'm trivializing, but could you reflect on this?
Yes, thank you for your kind words. No, I come from a studio where aesthetics were part of the ideology, and I hate aesthetics. Could the tree be a little bit more yellow, whatever? Could the facade be more brown? Could the column be more whatever? Aesthetics, I think, is dead in a way after Bauhaus and all the later modern and postmodern stuff. Because before aesthetics, you have ecology, right? I mean, in Holland, you're very worried about politics, but you have the water level rising just across the street. First thing should be ecology, and that's the first thing that architects and planners should think about. Not just global warming, but issues with water, issues with so many issues, sustainability. So we try to, and you know, in Moscow we did that, ecology first, and there's 30 or 100 years more to think about it, but it's very complicated. But how does that interact with cities and with architecture? It's just one thing. Second is mobility, much more interesting than aesthetics. Is very much related to traffic, of course, but what is slow mobility and how we can introduce sort of carbon-free mobility into cities. And then you have planning and architecture, and aesthetics really is like a vocabulary that can change. You know, Garcia Marquez would write without any commas or any dots. I'm being a little bit sloganish here too, and then others are more telegraphic, for example. So you have different kinds of vocabularies that you can write with. But at the end, if aesthetics is a main thing, it's really a way not to think about ecology, mobility, and other things which are becoming more and more important.
I must say I'm a bit puzzled by this assumed equivalence between aesthetics and beauty. I think it's very strange if you go to any bookshop and you look at the section called aesthetics. It doesn't talk about beauty, it talks about many things. It talk about the system of production of painting at Rembrandt's age, or lots of things. So why do we immediately shrink the debate by equating aesthetics with questions of the colors of the walls or whatever? And one thing I really learned from OMA, since obviously the office is very present tonight, is that there is a kind of resulting aesthetics, let's call it so, from the logic, from the strategic logic, internal, to a hard-won design, right? And let me just give you a little anecdote, because I'm not only like the Villa de Lava, but I also like very much the project of OMA for Léal in Paris, which, as you know, I wrote about and I defended. When this was typically the participatory, sort of so-called, or surrogate participatory project, whereby the municipality had organized a poll around the projects that were shown in models and plans and etc. And I would visit very often the exhibition because I was working on projects and I wanted to see the models, and people were there, people, not masses, just people coming to see what was being asked them to judge because they could vote in an urn like that. And they were talking and nobody was really there to explain, and sometimes I would enter discussions and explain to them the projects because I worked on them, I knew them. And it was fascinating to see people, when they started to understand how it worked, what the architect had thought was good, how such design strategically doing this and the other one rather doing that. Suddenly their advice, their discussion completely changed, and they stopped discussing about whether the sort of red and yellow derricks of OMA's project were nice or good looking or not. They were understanding the logic behind the project. So I think this is really something that could lead us to shift the debate towards questions which I'm very interested in and part of, which is about criticism, which is about teaching, which is about lots of things that have to do with shifting these, this idea that the masses don't know anything about aesthetics we like, and question our position as architects, form givers, for a different type of design that doesn't necessarily yield our expertise, but sort of advocates a different type of thinking and explaining what we do.
It's interesting you mentioned it, because I mean, in designing projects, any moment that you have to decide whether a wall is red or yellow is a moment of defeat. Yeah, and because it's as soon as it's and I always thought that broadly, and maybe I'm trivializing, that in architecture there are roughly two strands. I mean, I think there's a strands of architect that discover beauty as a result, or revel in a certain aesthetical delight over what they discover when trying to logically work on a process that creates a design. I think generally there is a strange element of surprise in a design process that you're looking for something and all of a sudden you're surprised by what you've created and then the experience goes, wow, beautiful, sorry for the word. But I mean that is and there are those who project and put a certain composition and in a way force logic to conform to a preconceived composition, and there is a way of designing where it's the other way around.
So therefore, does participation increase the likelihood of those chants?
I'm wondering, of course, I'm wondering out loud whether it could be an ingredient. I mean, if it's tales of the unexpected, partially aesthetic delight, I wonder whether then welcoming, what seems to be yet another disruptive force could actually contribute, if you're consistent in that philosophy that you discover beauty in things as they unfold, where participatory design could actually be a welcome ingredient.
Anyone? Pick up on that, right?
I was just thinking that aesthetics, there is also the parameter of technology, and maybe this would also help you to change into your last topic, but aesthetics were also always related with the technologies of production, no? And advances in materials, when concrete appeared, or let's say the modern movement, but also what we have been experiencing the last decade with the advanced manufacturing and digital fabrication has created new aesthetics. So I think that one could not be disconnected from the other. I basically doubt that aesthetics can be only the outcome of the process of design, whereas participatory or not. There are other agents that they are influencing in all this aesthetic generation related to technology, related to culture, related to manifestos as well, that makes the question a bit more complex than you have posted here today.
Can we take the technology?
I also think that it's not about control. I think the question is not framed very correctly. It's not about any form of aesthetic control. It's about emergence of aesthetics. No, like, let's not control the aesthetics. It's impossible. Not the architect, nor the masses, nor the individual, nor the users.
We lost our clicker.
Yeah, now it's the turn of the guy, the dusty guy from the archive, with technology. And yeah, today I found very interesting items in the archive from the 70s, the 80s, related to the theme of technology. So, will new IT technologies make participatory design inevitable? Yes, I do agree, of course. Technology has always been an expertise for architects, from the pyramids and the slaves, of course, till now. And, well, of course, it's a matter of, let's say, mastering complexity. Mastering complexity, that's how, let's say, architects are dealing with real work through technologies. Of course, by parameterizing a lot of information, we have to somehow understanding how reality is. So even if very, very rudimental mathematic approaches, that's how it worked. And that's how, let's say, IT informations are so interesting even now. Yeah, no, let's go, yeah. I mean, talking about making a city more efficient, big data, for instance, even in the 70s, they started understanding that through, let's say, urban metabolism, yeah, the city can be kind of understood as a vital, vibrant, living body. So, of course, it's something interesting to understand that a city is so complex and so full of, let's say, things that, of course, they have to be understood through the technology again. And, of course, big data, we have to be efficient. So, of course, even if, let's say,
these kind of technologies are going through a sort of, are making us a little bit more passive, because this hidden technology is somehow, let's say, collecting and gathering information. We should somehow welcome it, because city nowadays, they're not like 100 years ago. It's a too complex system, and of course, this kind of information, they are shaping a proper new topography of the city itself, because they are somehow, understanding our needs. Do we want to talk about social medias, for instance? They are somehow interesting tools, as we say here, to gather people sharing, the same ideas, or let's say similar ideas, to reach a common goal. So why should we be kind of afraid of IT technologies, or technology in general?
But could you say that?
Yes. That's what I want to say. Huh? No, I'm going to.
So, according to Gregorio, who had to answer to this ridiculous question, I completely disagree, and I think everyone will disagree with this. So, of course not. These new topographies that you talk about, they're actually the result of the flattening of the people's opinion and of the complexities that you were referring to. So, the fact of talking about neo IT like as a sort of remedy for or ultimate participatory thing, it's actually, I think it's actually completely the opposite, which is we have a lot of instead of being a retroactive kind of thing, it becomes much of a single dialogue, and that's what these guys stands for, I think, which is basically like we have these huge banks of data that are collecting our information and sort of processing it into this kind of understanding of complexity. So at the end of the day, they're just like choreographing, sort of directing us in a very, very smooth way into a logic of market economy. So as Saskia Sassen would say, this doesn't leave any opportunity for the city to talk back. The system is already answering already, so there's no dialogue. We cannot have a dialogue, so we cannot have a consensus. And if we don't have a consensus, then participation becomes just a single. It becomes an act of consultation, or a lot of acts of consultation put together. So we wanted to include you in this discussion, because actually what we was wondering, like coming back to the role of the architect from Facebook or Google, this big amount of data, was that actually like what we're implying is that neo-ITs are actually silencing us somehow. Like somebody in the public before said that, what about if it is a construction of new intelligences, or that architects, we are gaining intelligence from these sort of platforms of creative commons, and these kind of things. But actually, aren't we, even if we are good intentioned, which I think you are, aren't we just sort of making completely the opposite, in the sense that are we gaining this information, from these experiences that people share, and then just trying to do a sort of a second or expertise about this. So at the end of the day, we're sort of leading into a very common, nothing different than we already have, like a common commercial way of doing things.
Right, perhaps you could start by explaining the
I will
project
just
very
stop,
briefly.
because I disagree with both of you. I disagree with both sides, because I kind of have the sensation that you don't know what you're talking about when you do that you're talking about IT. What is IT? It's so broad. Is it the Internet of Things that we're talking about? Is it the technologies of fabrication that we're talking about? Is it the information and communication technologies applied into the urban scale in terms of sensors, actuators that we're talking about? Is it augmented reality that we're talking about? Is it user interfaces that we're talking about? There's such a kind of a wide range of ICT out there that I think it's not as simple as that. This is about distributed education. It's not about big data. It's really about small data. And there is difference about big data and small data. Big data is the new oil, Mark would say. I was in the Facebook campus after my trip in India, or before my trip in India, I don't remember anymore. I was in the Facebook campus there, and you could see, I was also actually surprised because I'm a bit criticizing all the kind of Facebook movement, but I was really surprised to see how the architecture of the spaces, the campus itself, is a kind of manifesto of social participation and application. Know how the architecture is doubting and questioning stereotypes of how we work, how we interact, how we enjoy nature in our free time. People are not forced to go to work. They can go, they cannot go. There is no schedule. Everything is for free. They don't pay for anything. The architecture that you can find there is a building of Gehry that you could hardly say that it is a building of Frank. So you can really see that the people there are participated and have participated into creating a kind of a more, let's say, environment that creates kind of new modes of habitation. Anyways, maybe I think that it's not the IT, but it is the internet that is actually empowering the people and allow them to participate. It is the internet age. It's the democratization of information. It's not any kind of centralized system, but it is this kind of peer-to-peer, decentralized and distributed, let's say, power that people start to have. And this is radically changing all the aspects of our interaction, all the aspects of our work as designers and as planners.
Hi. When this part, they're talking about using Facebook case to show that new IT will kind of people were using the data and control people's behavior and stuff. But I would say it's totally out of topic because we're talking about new IT technology, but not who is controlling it. New IT is a nurtural thing. We get data from the technology, which compares to traditional participatory design has a big advantage. As we mentioned before, architects have to design the process of participatory design. That means you always have a subjective idea when you design the process. Who is organizing the participatory design? The architects or some other organizations. Meanwhile, that means you already put a subjective idea when you're organizing people or inviting people or kind of forming or forming people what to talk or what to pick. While the new IT technology is totally not control. If we treat it as a technology, which means we assume that nobody is controlling it, while it can collect the data, while the people who are participating even not knowing people are collecting the data, which makes the data or makes the information in a more natural way. And the point you gave me, which I think it's more important to say we shouldn't let those data falling into some individuals or powerful parties, but make it more open. But IT itself is nothing is wrong with it. Yeah.
Yes, sir. I wanted to, I viewed already how complicated this question is. New IT technologies would make participatory design inevitable. Yes, I was in California, it was not Facebook, but it was also a CGI company, and they talked about workflows a lot. And they were talking how you can go from freehand to CAD to 3D to BIM with one workflow. That means that there's going to be different people participating in this workflow or teams of people, and it does have an influence on the final design. So they are thinking of doing like an umbrella program that will take from freehand to BIM in real time. So basically IT is the cloud. They're working all the time in the cloud. And what they're doing is they're rendering at the same time that you're drawing. And there's different kinds of experts participating in that workflow. So yes, to the question.
Gentlemen, and then we have come back to the
I can say from my personal experience that IT technologies can be dangerous, but it can also make participation, in my opinion, inevitable. Like my second year of studies, I already had a project where I could gather the data of like 200 people, 200 friends, and they just informed our the layout of our city development. And it was super nice in that time. Like we just set up the design and like all the kind of rules, and then people just participated by giving us the data anyway. But so it makes communication process much easier, and I think that's also what IT technologies do nowadays. But I think it's also very dangerous in that way that I control the whole design process without letting the people participate before and what kind of demands they actually have. So this kind of things they have to go hand in hand, like IT technologies and also the participation.
You're right, but at the same time, new technologies is the end of the expert in many ways. I mean, anybody can design a book. Anybody can correct text with a word automatic correctors. Design. I'm not saying it's fine or not. I'm saying it's a fact. It's the end of the expert. De facto, it's already is. Tomorrow, everybody can design their own furniture and do it with 3D printers. That's the next move of the industry towards giving each individual. I insist on that. The idea of individualization for new technologies, their own printing machine whereby you can do what you like, right? And you have the right to do so, right? So this should go towards your, instead of being afraid, you should see perhaps in this, the triumph of the idea of participation. Everybody participates, and that brings so much money to everyone. Great, right? And on the other hand, I think the other side has a point too, because there's nothing more totalitarian than new technologies. So that's the devilish thing we're in. So how do we think that? I mean, since Ricardo is talking about the BIM, this new thing that architects are going to have to deal with, already have, which is the triumph of, under the guise of synthesis and interactive design, of, I think, I mean, I simplify it perhaps a bit for the argument, but of how the industry is going to triumph completely inside the design process, with having just their products to stick in the cloud, in the model, and have and make the estimate at the same time, etc. You will never get out of it. So is this model of the BIM out of new technologies couldn't be a sort of model for something else, which is not technological, but this kind of social interface between the radical individualism and the expertise that perhaps can help it to emerge in a coherent way. Perhaps this idea of yes, finding a third way between these two extremes is a task that architecture, because it has to do with space somehow, can perhaps entail.
I just wanted to give a suggestion of how you could make yourself useful to the masses and to yourself, is you have the tools. So you have the tools to be able to contribute when some big towers get produced, to be able to determine where will the shadows fall, or make a quick assessment of the effect of wind. And it's interesting that in London there's huge debates about tower projects, and the first one which has been refused planning permission is the one where architects are involved in the debate, because they've actually modelled the towers that have been put forward for Bishopsgate, and a whole campaign, More Light, More Power, has come from some anonymous architect casting the shadow. So you have, this moment, you have the ability, and perhaps you have the ability to critically enter into the BIM model and demonstrate to others what choices are being made on their behalf by others. So that's, you have those tools that we probably don't.
I kind of sympathise with you, sir, because I mean I agree with both sides. I mean I think technology, IT technology, like any technology very broadly, is basically agnostic. What happens, you see that anyway, that with the internet I think it both catalyzes totalitarianism and it catalyzes individualism, both at the same time. Technology exacerbates, and it exacerbates whatever, and what happens is ultimately in the political choices you make afterwards. I think also the notion of architects disappearing, that is somehow a very psychological thing ingrained in the head of architects. I mean, there's this famous quote from Mies van der Rohe that fantasizes about industrialization, the main thing of his time, where he say it's only a matter of time before industrialization will solve all technical, intellectual, and political problems. And in a way, you could say that there was an enormous amount of Bauhaus people involved in the microrayons in the Platterbau of East Germany, where architects de facto disappeared. They designed systems, they had no say in where the buildings went, and the whole thing went on auto motion. It solved the big housing crisis, by the way. Nevertheless, the system doesn't survive. History isn't linear, and you can always, once you reach the end of history, there's always inevitably a revolt against this, because at the moment that the DDR, in a way, had millions of houses constructed like that, the wall fell, and in a way the star architect emerged after the disappearance of the architect. And I still think, yes, it's very true what you say about IT technology, but I still think there will be something after. There is always political choices you make afterwards that determine the legacy of technology. And it's also not up to architects to agree or disagree with technology, because technology you don't stop. Once you know something, you cannot go back to not knowing, unless you become senile. But then the only thing forward is then what do you do with the knowledge? And therefore, I agree with both sides. I don't think there's any technology has an automatic inevitability one way or the other. It's often the inevitability of both. Do you want to have the last word?
Yeah.
I thought so.
No, I just wanted to add one thought. Quite much like the expression, technology is agnostic. Last week I quoted Umberto Eco, the Italian semiologist, asked to kind of defining technology. He stated, well, internet is somehow like a stupid divinity. It knows everything. It's like the fool of the village. It's like someone who knows an encyclopedia, by memory. And of course, I mean, you just have to pose the right to raise the right questions to it. Of course, we can have extremes. We can go through the totalitarian vision of reality, the apocalyptic dystopian view of the world, and of course also the utopian one, and the positivistic one, actually. So I mean, this is something I would say it's really a sort of open question. Something, and it's my very personal opinion. It's something I really cannot give an answer to it. It's really, I mean, IT technologies, internet, it's really a stupid divinity. Because it knows everything.
But there is, I mean,
I don't agree. It's not like, I really feel that it's not like technology or internet knows everything. It's kind of,
potential.
It has the possibility
Exactly.
of, let's say, advancing the knowledge, and what it does, what technology does good is not getting tired, no? Like repeating and automating without, let's say, getting tired or destroyed. but there is not any cognitive decision behind that.
It advances knowledge. I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is the nature of the debate. But it advances a knowledge that somehow is created. Do we really possess the knowledge to participate, to how to make a successful participatory design project?
On the subject of
I've lost the plot.
the subject of untiring technology and automation. Credit to we've had a bit of a monologue going along the outside. So technology. I mean, this was meant to be the one event where it was good to be texting while the speaker was speaking. But we've had rather a monologue, so this is untiring, unrelenting technology over here by a very.
But I want to make a comment on stupid, very passionately.
To discuss in the bar, keep this in your brains for discussions with you.
We don't.
Oh,
No, there is always a moment when stupid outsmarts smart. That is the nature of technology. There were chess computers, Kasparov and those guys, they beat them with 2 fingers in their nose until they didn't. Until the fact that the computer didn't get tired, that at a certain moment the quantity of things they could process at the same time became more powerful than intuition, which is linked to the limited capacity of the human brain. At which point I think that is an interesting notion that simply that the village fool, who knows the entire encyclopedia by heart, if he has a very good memory, will simply know factual answers quicker than somebody who has a hunch. And that is a very fundamental disposition in a human brain.
Yes, Rene, but the computer doesn't feel happy to have won.
Exactly. Isn't that the ultimate victory, though?
Thank you to the few of you who did participate, and hopefully the rest of you will participate in drinking with me.
Thank you very much. Thanks Areti, thanks Francoise, thanks Liza, thanks Nona, thanks Ricardo, thanks Salomon, thanks Hugo, thanks Martin, and thanks to all the participants, and thanks for showing up.
Okay, so I take my one.